The paper in Sera's pocket felt like a brand, the sharp edge of the eviction notice pressing against her thigh with every step she took across the lobby of Calloway Group. The air in here didn't belong to the same world as the one she'd left in Greyhill. It was filtered, expensive, and carried the faint, metallic scent of air-conditioned prestige. She didn't look at the soaring glass ceiling. She didn't look at the art on the walls that cost more than her mother's medical debt. She looked at the floor, focusing on the rhythmic click of her heels until she reached the elevator. The second floor was quieter, the carpet thick enough to swallow the sound of a person's arrival. Sera stopped in front of a door that bore no name, only a number. She smoothed the front of her coat, her fingers trembling once before she clamped them into a fist. She had rehearsed the answers to the questions they would ask. Why did you leave your last position? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? She hadn't rehearsed for him. The office was a cathedral of wood and light. He was standing by the window, his back to the room, the silhouette of his shoulders instantly familiar in a way that made the breath hitch in her throat. It was a stillness she recognized, the posture of a man who didn't move until he was certain of the kill. "You're 4 minutes early," he said. His voice hadn't changed. It was still a low, resonant vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of her bones. He turned, and for a split second the mask slipped. A shadow of something raw and jagged crossed Declan Calloway's face, a ghost of the boy who had once promised her the world under a Greyhill moon. Then he killed it. His expression went flat, professional, and terrifyingly distant. "Sera. Mr. Calloway." She used the name like a shield, a reminder of the distance he had put between them with 10 years of silence. He didn't invite her to sit. He didn't ask about her mother or the decade of wreckage she had navigated while he built this empire. He simply walked to his desk and picked up a single sheet of paper, her resume, the one she had sent into the void of a corporate portal, never dreaming it would end up in his hands. "The position of floor coordinator is open," he said, his eyes scanning the page as if he were reading a grocery list rather than the credentials of a woman overqualified by 2 full tiers. "It's entry-level, administrative support, logistical oversight for the lower divisions." Sera felt the heat rise in her neck. "I managed an entire department in Chicago, Declan. You know what I'm capable of." "I know what the listing pays," he countered, finally looking up. His eyes were like flint. "And I know what Greyhill costs these days, the facility where your mother stays. They raised their rates again last month, didn't they?" The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized by the reality of the notice in her pocket. He knew. He had looked into her life before she even walked through the door. He wasn't offering her a career. He was offering her a leash. "The salary is non-negotiable," he continued, tossing the paper onto the desk. "You'll report to the head of operations, but your desk will be on the 2nd floor. Do you want it or not?" Sera looked at the man she had once loved, searching for a trace of the person who had left her without a word. There was nothing but the cold glass of the Calloway Group reflected in his pupils. She thought of the empty cupboards in her apartment and the woman in the nursing home who looked at her with vacant eyes. "I'll take it," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Good, my assistant will have the paperwork. Don't be late tomorrow." He turned back to the window before she had even reached the door. As Sera stepped out into the hallway, a man in a sharp suit, Declan's personal assistant, stood by the desk, his eyes fixed on her with an unreadable, pitying intensity. She hurried past him, the elevator doors closing just as she felt the first sob clawing at her throat. Behind the closed door of the corner office, Declan didn't move. He picked up the phone, his gaze fixed on the folder he had pulled from the trash that morning. "The Voss file," he said into the receiver, his voice tight. "Mark it as hired and cancel the other interviews." The fluorescent lights of the 14th floor flickered with a rhythmic, surgical hum that vibrated in the back of Sera's skull. 3 weeks into her sentence at Calloway Group, and the air already felt thin, like it was being sucked out of the building by the sheer force of Declan's ambition. She spent her days filing reports she could have written in her sleep, moving through the halls like a ghost in a pencil skirt, performing the role of the invisible girl with a precision that bordered on masochism. She was halfway through a logistics audit when the world tilted. The copper taste of nausea hit her first, sharp and sudden. Sera didn't think, she moved. She bypassed the common restrooms on the second floor, her feet carrying her upward, seeking the silence of the executive tier. In the 14th floor bathroom, the marble was cold enough to bite through her palms as she gripped the edge of the sink. She barely made it to the stall before her body betrayed her. The silence of the restroom was absolute, save for the sound of her own ragged breathing and the drip of a faucet. She stayed on the floor for a long time, her forehead pressed against the cool tile, watching a single bead of water tremble on the chrome. 6 weeks. The math was a jagged thing, cutting through the fog of her exhaustion. She hadn't been with anyone since the divorce, except for that final, desperate night in Grayhill before she'd fled for good. She stood up, her legs feeling like water, and rinsed her mouth. She didn't look in the mirror. If she didn't see the ghost of the girl she used to be, maybe she could pretend the girl didn't exist. She stepped out into the corridor, adjusting her blazer, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She didn't notice Pieter, Declan's lead assistant, standing by the water fountain until she was 3 feet away. He didn't look at her. He was checking his watch, his expression as blank as a fresh sheet of stationery. But as she passed, the air between them shifted. He knew the executive floor was off-limits to floor coordinators. He knew she looked like she'd just survived a car wreck. He didn't say a word to her. He didn't have to. 20 minutes later, the glass doors of Declan's office didn't just open, they seemed to exhale. Pieter walked out, his face strangely pale, carrying a small cardboard box. He didn't stop at his desk. He kept walking, the rhythmic thud of his shoes the only sound in the sudden, suffocating silence of the executive wing. Declan was standing behind his desk when the door clicked shut. He didn't look like a man who had just terminated his most loyal employee. He looked like a hunter who had found a blood trail. He picked up a pen, twirling it between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the empty chair where Pieter had sat moments ago. He knew. He had the information now, tucked away like a weapon he wasn't quite ready to draw. Sera's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sera, the voice on the other end was frail, paper-thin, and laced with a confusion that made Sera's stomach turn all over again. "Mara, is that you? When are you coming home? The man was here again. He said the bill was settled. He said you didn't have to worry." Sera gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Her mother hadn't called her by her own name in 3 years. "Mom, it's Sera, who was there, who settled the bill." The line went quiet, the kind of silence that only exists in Grayhill, thick with secrets and the smell of damp earth. "The boy," her mother whispered, her voice drifting away into the static. "The one with the angry eyes. He told me not to tell you. He said you'd only try to pay him back and you don't have anything left to give." Sera looked up, and through the glass wall of the lobby, she saw Declan Calloway watching her from the mezzanine, his silhouette cutting a dark, jagged hole in the light. He wasn't moving. He was just waiting for her to realize that the cage she was in didn't have bars. It had a balance sheet. The brass plate on the elevator call button was cold against Sera's thumb, a small mercy for the feverish static humming in her blood. She clutched a stack of logistics binders to her chest like armor, her mind tallying the cost of the Grayhill Pharmacy receipt now tucked inside her jacket. The double doors slid open with a hushed, expensive sigh. She didn't look up as she stepped in. She didn't have to. The air in the car changed instantly, the scent of sandalwood and rain, sharp enough to cut through the sterile scent of floor wax. Declan was already there. The elevator was a box of mirrors and polished steel, and for a moment the only sound was the mechanical click of the doors sealing them in. The executive priority override was dark. He hadn't bypassed the floors, he had simply been waiting. Sera stood 3 feet away, her gaze fixed on the digital floor counter as it began its slow crawl from 3 toward 23. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, pressurized, vibrating with the ghost of every word they hadn't said for a decade. Sera could feel the weight of his stare on the side of her neck, a physical heat that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She tightened her grip on the binders, her knuckles turning the color of bone. "The Harmon quarterly projection," Declan said. His voice was a low, jagged rasp in the small space. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't an apology. It was a clinical observation that made her heart kick against her ribs. "The data was inconsistent," he continued, his shadow stretching across the reflective metal floor until it touched the toes of her shoes. "You flagged the discrepancies in the margin. Why?" Sera didn't turn. She watched the number 12 glow and fade, because the numbers were lying. "Accuracy is a dangerous habit for someone in your position, Sera." "I was taught to finish what I started," she replied, the words sharp and brittle. The car shuddered slightly, a micro-adjustment in the shaft that forced her to shift her weight. The movement brought her jacket pocket closer to him, close enough that the crinkle of the Grayhill test strip sounded like a gunshot in her own ears. Declan moved. He didn't touch her, but he stepped into her peripheral vision, his presence an eclipse. "You look tired," he murmured. The cold professionalism was still there, but beneath it, something else was beginning to fray, a raw, dangerous edge of the boy who used to know the exact rhythm of her breathing. "I'm working," she said, 4 words, a wall. The chime for the 23rd floor rang out, a sharp, silver note that broke the spell. The doors retreated. Sera didn't wait. She stepped out into the plush carpet of the executive lobby, her spine rigid, her heels clicking a frantic tempo against the floor. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She didn't have to see his face to know the trap was tightening. The elevator doors began to slide shut behind her, but before they met, the sharp buzz of a notification echoed from the car. Declan's phone lit up in the reflection of the steel. A name flashed across the screen in bold, elegant script, Isolde. Underneath it, a single line of text, "My father is expecting the formal announcement at the gala. Don't be late." The doors hissed closed, leaving Sera alone in the hall with the weight of the test in her pocket and a new, freezing realization. She wasn't the only one with something to lose. The scent of expensive lilies and floor wax was a suffocating shroud in the Calloway Group ballroom. Sera's thumbs were raw from pinning name placards to silk-draped tables, her simple black dress a dull bruise against the riot of designer chiffon and diamonds swirling around her. She wasn't a guest, she was infrastructure. She kept her head down, focusing on the calligraphy of the elite, until the air in the room suddenly thinned. Isolde Vane didn't walk into a room, she colonized it. Her dress was the color of a fresh arterial wound, a deep, shimmering crimson that seemed to pulse under the crystal chandeliers. She moved toward the registration table with a predator's grace, her hand already reaching out to hook firmly into Declan's arm. He looked taller tonight, more remote, the black tuxedo making him look like a man carved from obsidian. "You must be the new floor coordinator," Isolde said. Her voice was like honey poured over a blade, warm, sweet, and dangerously sharp. She didn't wait for a response before leaning in, the scent of her perfume hitting Sera like a physical blow. "Declan mentioned your efficiency. It's so rare to find someone from a place like Grayhill who understands the delicacy of a firm like this." Sera's fingers froze on a placard for a senator. "I'm here to do a job, Miss Vane." "Of course you are." Isolde's smile didn't reach her eyes, which remained cold and calculating as they swept over Sera's tired face. She reached out, adjusting the collar of Declan's jacket with a proprietary flick of her wrist. "But efficiency can sometimes look like desperation, can't it? I've told Declan that perhaps your talents are being wasted here. You look like you're used to much heavier lifting." Declan said nothing. He stared over Sera's head, his jaw set so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. He didn't defend her. He didn't even look at her. He simply allowed himself to be led away into the sea of black ties, leaving Sera standing in the wake of Isolde's silent victory. The humiliation came at midnight, delivered not by words but by a vibration in her pocket. Sera pulled out her phone to find a system-wide notification from building management. Reassignment notice, S. Voss. Effective immediately. Night inventory team, warehouse level be no reason given. No appeal offered. She looked across the ballroom. Through a gap in the dancing couples, she saw Declan watching her. He was holding a glass of scotch, his expression unreadable, but he didn't move to stop her as she began to gather her things. "Leaving so soon?" A man was standing by the table. He was broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a shipyard and eyes that had seen things a ballroom couldn't imagine. Cormac Fenn, the VP of Logistics, didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a terrifyingly focused interest. He watched her hand shake as she tucked the registration list into her bag, and then his gaze shifted to Declan. "The night shift is cold, Sera," Cormac said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "And the basements in this building have a habit of burying things people want to forget. You might find you need a different kind of ally before the sun comes up." He didn't offer to help. He simply watched her walk toward the service exit, while across the room, Declan's glass shattered in his hand, the amber liquid staining the white tablecloth like a map of a war he was already losing. The air in warehouse level B tasted of wet concrete and old cardboard, a subterranean chill that seeped through Sera's thin coat and settled deep in her joints. Down here, the glittering towers of Calloway Group felt like a fever dream. She spent the small hours of the morning counting crates of high-end office furniture, the scratch of her pen on the clipboard the only sound in the hollow silence. Her banishment was physical. Every muscle in her body ached with the weight of it. Route 9 Diner still has the best coffee in the county, though they always burn the toast on Tuesdays. Sera didn't jump, but the pen slipped, marking a jagged black line across her inventory sheet. Cormac Fenn was leaning against a stack of industrial pallets, looking entirely too clean for the basement. He held two steaming cups, the smell of cheap, bitter beans cutting through the damp. "I didn't think VPs ventured this far below sea level," Sera said, her voice raspy from hours of silence. "I'm in logistics, Sera. I go where the assets are." He stepped closer, offering a cup. "And I know Greyhill. I spent 6 months there on a salvage contract 3 years ago. It's a hard town to leave and a harder one to come back to." She took the cup, the heat of the cardboard stinging her frozen palms. Cormac didn't look at her with the suffocating intensity Declan used. He looked at her with the steady, gauging eye of a man who knew exactly how to reinforce a structure before it collapsed. "If you're looking for a reason for the move, don't," she muttered. "I know how this building works." "Do you?" Cormac reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, sliding it onto the top of her clipboard. "Because I don't think you do. Declan Calloway plays a long game, but he's not the only one at the table. If the basement starts to feel too much like a grave, call the number on the back. No strings, just a way out." He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned and walked toward the freight elevator, his silhouette broad and unshakable against the dim emergency lights. Sera stared at the card. She didn't need it. She couldn't afford to need it. She tucked it into her pocket anyway, right next to the positive pregnancy test. By noon, the basement was a memory. The reassignment notice hit her tablet with the force of a physical blow. Promotion, personal coordinator to the C-suite. Location, floor 23. There was no explanation, no interview, just a digital keycard update and a demand for her presence upstairs. When she stepped off the elevator into the hushed luxury of the 23rd floor, the contrast was violent. The floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of the city, a sprawling kingdom Declan had built from the ashes of their past. Her new desk was situated 10 feet from his office door, close enough to hear the low murmur of his voice, close enough to see the shadow he cast on the frosted glass. She stood by the window, her hand resting on her stomach, watching the clouds move over the skyline. She didn't know yet that her predecessor had been sent to a satellite office 6,000 miles away. She didn't know that Cormac had sent a single text to the office next door that was currently making Declan's blood boil. The door to Declan's office remained shut, but she could hear his private line ringing. Once, twice. The calls were from Isolde. He didn't answer. Instead, the shadow behind the glass moved, growing larger until the door swung open. Declan stood in the frame, his tie loosened, his eyes dark with a possessive, fractured fury. He didn't look at the files on her desk. He looked at her, his gaze dropping to the pocket where Cormac's card sat hidden. "You're late," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Don't let it happen again. You're exactly where I want you now, Sera. Nowhere left to run." The nursing facility's quarterly care summary sat on the passenger seat like a live grenade. Sera didn't need to open the envelope to feel the weight of the numbers inside. She already knew the math of her mother's survival didn't add up to the balance in her own bank account. But it was the administrative note tucked behind the invoice that had turned the air in her lungs to ice. A lump sum endowment, established in 2014, prepaying 7 years of specialized care. The donor wasn't her. It wasn't the state, it was a ghost. The drive to Greyhill was a blur of gray asphalt and the skeletal remains of winter trees. The Route 9 diner flickered past, its neon sign buzzing with a dying hum, a reminder of the life she'd traded for a decade of silence. She pulled into the driveway of her father's house, the tires crunching over gravel that hadn't been turned in years. The air here smelled different, damp earth, wood smoke, and the heavy, stagnant scent of things left to rot in the dark. The house was a tomb. Dust motes danced in the thin, pale light filtering through the grime on the windows. Sera didn't stop to look at the photos on the mantel or the chair where her father used to sit. She went straight to the master bedroom closet. The floorboards creaked under her weight, a sharp, protesting sound in the absolute quiet of the dead house. The lockbox was exactly where she'd left it, buried under a pile of moth-eaten wool blankets. The metal was cold, the lock yielding with a stubborn, rusted click. Her hands didn't shake as she lifted the lid. That was the frightening part, the surgical precision of her own detachment. The wire transfer receipt was on top, the ink faded but the numbers still screaming off the page. $50,000. Wired on the exact date Declan Calloway had disappeared from Greyhill. The account number was a direct line to a boy who had nothing, signed off by a man who had everything to lose. Clipped to the back was a note in her father's jagged, cramped handwriting. "He knew." 2 words that dismantled 10 years of grief. 2 words that turned a tragic departure into a business transaction. Declan hadn't been forced out, he had been bought. He had taken the price of her heart and used it to lay the first brick of his empire. Sera sat on the hardwood floor, the receipt fluttering between her fingers. The silence of the house pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. She stayed there for 1 hour and 40 minutes, watching the shadows stretch across the floor until the room was swallowed by the approaching dusk. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply filed the information into the cold, dark place where she kept the rest of her wreckage. The drive back to the city was silent. No music, no thoughts, just the rhythmic vibration of the steering wheel. Her phone began to vibrate in the cup holder as she hit the city limits. Declan Calloway, private. The screen lit up the dark cabin of the car. She watched it ring. 7 times the name flashed, a demand for her attention that she no longer felt the need to fulfill. When the screen finally went dark, a text arrived 30 seconds later. I need the Harmon file before Monday. DC. Sera reached out and turned the phone face down on the passenger seat, right on top of the nursing facility envelope. The wire transfer receipt was tucked into her inner coat pocket, resting against her ribs like a blade. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, the pale skin, the hollow eyes, the mouth set in a line of grim, absolute resolve. She wasn't the invisible girl anymore. She was the one holding the bill. As she pulled into her apartment complex, her hand brushed the pregnancy test still buried in her other pocket. The secret was growing, a physical weight to match the paper one against her heart. She hadn't taken the test yet, but she didn't need a chemical reaction to tell her what her body already knew. The trap hadn't been set by Declan alone. It had been a collaborative effort, a decade in the making. And as she climbed the stairs to her darkened apartment, the only thought in her mind was how much interest a 10-year-old betrayal gathered when it was paid in blood. The 23rd floor was a vacuum. Behind the soundproof glass of the conference room, the city moved in a silent, frantic blur, but inside, the only sound was the rhythmic tap of Declan's fountain pen against a leather-bound folder. Sera stood at the head of the table, the Harmon quarterly debrief projected onto the wall behind her. The blue light of the data charts washed out her skin, making her look like a phantom haunting her own presentation. She didn't look at the 3 senior partners sitting to her left. She didn't look at Cormac, who was watching her with a terrifyingly focused stillness from the far end of the table. She looked only at Declan. The discrepancy in the offshore accounts isn't a rounding error, Sera said, her voice cutting through the tension like a wire. It's a deliberate diversion. $50,000 moved every quarter for the last decade, disguised as maintenance fees for the Grayhill holdings. Holdings that on paper don't exist. The pen in Declan's hand stopped. He didn't look up. The silence in the room became a physical weight, pressing the air out of the lungs of everyone present. One of the partners cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound that died instantly under the shadow of Declan's silence. "Explain your conclusion, Ms. Voss," Cormac prompted, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't helping her. He was opening the cage door to see if she'd run or bite. Sera reached into her folder. She didn't pull out a chart. She pulled out a photocopy of the wire transfer receipt she had found in the Grayhill lockbox, the one signed by her father, dated the day Declan disappeared. She slid it across the polished mahogany. It came to rest inches from Declan's hand. "The conclusion is that Calloway Group isn't just a firm," Sera said, her gaze fixed on the man who had bought her father's silence with the capital of their future. "It's a monument built on a bribe, and the interest is finally due." Declan finally looked up. His eyes weren't cold. They were hollow, reflecting the blue light of the projector like frozen water. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look at the paper. He simply looked at her, and for a heartbeat, the mask of the billionaire CEO vanished, leaving behind the boy who had once traded his soul to save a girl who didn't know she was being sold. "Out," Declan said. It wasn't a shout. It was a whisper that shook the glass walls. The partners scrambled, gathering their tablets and fleeing the room as if the building were on fire. Cormac stood slowly, his eyes moving between Sera and Declan. He lingered for a second, his hand brushing the back of Sera's chair, a silent offer of a different kind of alliance, before he, too, vanished into the hallway. The door clicked shut, the vacuum sealed. "You went back to the house," Declan said. He stood up, his height looming over the table, his presence an eclipse that swallowed the room. "I told you once that Greyhill was a grave. Why can't you let the dead stay buried?" "Because I'm the one who had to live in the cemetery," Sera's composure snapped, the 10 years of repressed rage finally boiling over. "You took the money, Declan. You took $50,000 to leave me. You didn't fight. You didn't stay. You put a price on us and you cashed the check." He moved then, rounding the table with a predatory speed that pinned her against the edge of the credenza. He didn't touch her, but he was so close she could feel the heat radiating off his skin, the scent of sandalwood and old secrets. "I took that money so your father wouldn't put you in the ground alongside your mother's sanity," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "He gave me a choice. Take the cash and build something, or stay and watch him dismantle your life piece by piece. I chose the empire, Sera. I chose to become the man who could eventually buy the ground he stood on." "And what did it cost you?" she whispered, her hand instinctively hovering over the secret growing in her womb. "Everything," he said, his voice breaking for the first time in 10 years. He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw, a ghost of a caress that felt like a brand. For a second, the distance between them vanished. The betrayal, the money, the 10 years of silence, it all fell away, leaving only the raw, jagged pulse of two people who had destroyed each other to survive. Then the intercom buzzed. "Mr. Calloway, Isolde is in the lobby. She says she's here for the formal announcement. The senator is on the line." The heat in Declan's eyes vanished, replaced by a shuttered, mechanical coldness. He stepped back, straightening his cuffs, the CEO persona sliding back into place like a suit of armor. "Stay in this room," he commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Don't move until I come back." He walked out without looking back. Sera stood alone in the blue light, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at the table. The wire transfer receipt was still there, but next to it, Declan had left his private phone, the screen glowing with a new message from an unsaved number. "The blood results from the executive clinic are in, Mr. Calloway. You were right to flag the 14th floor waste bins. It's a match." Sera felt the floor tilt. He knew. He hadn't just been watching her career, he had been stalking her biology. She reached for the phone, her fingers trembling, but before she could touch it, the door opened again. It wasn't Declan. Isolde Vane stood in the doorway, her red dress looking like a fresh wound against the sterile white of the hall. She wasn't smiling anymore. She held a manila envelope in her hand, her eyes fixed on Sera with a look of pure, calculated execution. "You have the wrong idea about how this ends, Sera," Isolde said, her voice as smooth as silk. "Declan doesn't keep things he can't control, and right now you're the only variable left to delete." The manila envelope landed on the mahogany table with a wet thud, the sound of a guillotine blade hitting the block. Isolde didn't sit. She stood over Sera, her shadow stretching long and jagged across the quarterly data still glowing on the wall. The scent of her perfume, something expensive and suffocating, like lilies in a closed room, filled the space Declan had just vacated. "Declan has a weakness for strays," Isolde said, her voice dropping to a low, melodic purr. "He thinks he's saving you. He thinks that by keeping you on the 23rd floor, he can control the blast radius of whatever mess you've brought with you from the gutter." She flicked the edge of the envelope. "But HR doesn't care about sentiment, and my father doesn't care about old flames." Sera didn't reach for the envelope. She kept her hands flat on the table, the cold wood pressing against her palms. "You've been busy, Isolde." "I've been thorough." Isolde leaned in, her eyes tracing the line of Sera's throat. "The Grey Hill facility, the one where your mother spends her days staring at walls, the funding didn't just appear from thin air. It was channeled through a subsidiary of Vane Industries 3 years ago as part of a discretionary merger. Which means, effectively, I own the bed she sleeps in. I own the air she breathes. And as of 10 minutes ago, I've flagged her account for an immediate care review due to administrative irregularities." The air in the room suddenly felt like glass in Sera's lungs. "She has nothing to do with this." "She is the only thing you have left to lose," Isolde countered. She pulled a single sheet of paper from the envelope, a termination notice already signed. Not by Declan, by the chief of legal operations, Senator Vane's brother. "You're being let go, Sera. Gross misconduct, corporate espionage. We'll say you were found accessing sensitive financial data, which technically you just did in front of the entire board." "Declan won't let you," Sera whispered, though the words felt hollow even as they left her lips. Isolde laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Declan is currently in a closed-door meeting with my father and the board of directors, finalizing the merger that will make him the most powerful man in the tri-state area. Do you really think he's going to risk a billion-dollar legacy for a girl who's already proven she has a price?" Isolde straightened her silk blazer, her expression turning into one of clinical boredom. "The security guards are already at your desk. Your personal items have been moved to the loading dock. Don't bother with the elevator. Use the stairs." As Isolde swept out of the room, the heavy glass door didn't click shut. It was caught by a hand. Cormac Fenn stood in the doorway, his face a mask of granite. He watched Isolde disappear down the hall before turning his gaze to Sera. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer comfort. "He's sitting in that meeting, Sera," Cormac said, his voice a jagged rasp. "He's watching them sign the papers. He heard the security call come through on his headset and he didn't blink. He's letting it happen." Sera stood up, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the plastic edge of the test. She looked at the office door where Declan was sealing his future, and then at the staircase that led to the street. "Then let him," Sera said, her voice dropping into a register Cormac hadn't heard before, a cold, shimmering lethality. She walked past him, but as she reached the threshold, her phone chimed in her hand. A notification from her bank. "Transaction alert, wire transfer received. 50,000, source, C Group escrow." Underneath the alert was a single, unsigned text. "Leave the city tonight. It's not safe anymore." She looked up at the ceiling, at the vents humming with recycled air, realizing for the first time that the man in the next room wasn't trying to keep her close. He was trying to pay her off before the real blood hit the floor. The loading dock was a cavern of exhaust and shadows, the air tasting of diesel and the coming rain. Sera's life, the few boxes that hadn't been lost in the move from Chicago, sat on a wooden pallet like a pile of discarded evidence. She stood under the yellow glare of a security light, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of her suitcase, watching a black sedan idle at the curb. It wasn't a taxi. The driver was Cormac Fenn's personal security. "You aren't leaving," a voice echoed through the concrete space. Declan emerged from the service elevator, his silhouette jagged and imposing against the white tile of the freight bay. He had stripped off his tuxedo jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking like a man who had crawled out of a wreckage. He wasn't the CEO now. He was the boy from Grey Hill who had once traded a heart for an empire, and he looked like he was drowning in the difference. "The wire transfer cleared, Declan," Sera said, her voice a flat, dead line. Consider the debt settled. You paid for 10 years of my life. You don't get a minute more." He didn't stop until he was a breath away, the heat of him cutting through the basement chill. The money wasn't a payoff, Sera. It was a shield. The senator's daughter doesn't play games. She removes obstacles. If that money is in your account, my legal team can track you. It's the only way I can keep the Vanes from erasing you the way they erased your father's legacy. Sera laughed, a jagged sound that scraped her throat. My father's legacy was a bribe. You knew that. You took it. You let me believe for a decade that I wasn't enough to make you stay, when the reality was just that 50,000 was enough to make you go. I took it because it was the only way to get him to sign the medical release for your mother, Declan hissed, his hand slamming against the metal cage of the pallet. He was going to let her rot in that state ward. I bought her life, Sera, and I've been paying for it every day since. The revelation didn't bring relief. It brought a new kind of vertigo. The world was a series of cages, each one nested inside the other. "Is that what this is?" she whispered, looking up at him. "Another transaction. You hire me, you banish me, you pay me to leave again. When do I get to be a person instead of a line item?" Declan's hand moved, his fingers hovering inches from her stomach, his gaze dropping to the swell she hadn't yet begun to show. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the executive clinic's report. He knew. He had known before she did. "I didn't authorize the termination," he said, his voice cracking. "Isolde used a back channel, the merger. It's not just a business deal, Sera, it's a takeover. If I don't sign those papers tonight, they'll pull the funding for the Grayhill facility. They'll have you arrested for the data leak before you hit the city limits." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key, not to a room, but to a safety deposit box. "The Vanes aren't just shareholders," Declan whispered, leaning in until his forehead touched hers. "They're the ones who funded your father's original debt, the 50,000. It wasn't my money, Sera, it was theirs. They've owned us both since the beginning." A sudden, sharp glare of headlights flooded the loading dock. A second car pulled in, blocking the exit. The passenger window rolled down, revealing the cold, porcelain profile of Senator Vane. He didn't look at Declan. He looked at the suitcase on the pallet. "The clock is ticking, Declan," the senator called out, his voice thin and oily. "The girl leaves or the facility closes. Choose the legacy or the liability." Declan's grip tightened on the brass key. He looked at Sera, the desperation in his eyes clashing with a decade of calculated coldness. He wasn't deciding her fate, he was realizing he had already lost his own. "Tell me to my face," Sera challenged, her voice a low, shimmering threat as she stepped toward the senator's car. "Tell me which one I am." The silence in the loading dock was more violent than the senator's threat. Declan stood frozen between the two cars, the one meant to spirit Sera away into a comfortable, paid-off exile, and the one holding the man who owned the air they were breathing. Senator Vane didn't look at Sera. He tapped a manicured finger against the leather armrest of his door. 10 seconds, Declan. The merger is on the table, or the Grayhill facility is on the market. Decency is a luxury for men who don't have legacies to protect." Sera didn't wait for Declan to answer. She walked toward the senator's car, her reflection ghosting across the blacked-out glass. She reached into her pocket, but she didn't pull out the brass key. She pulled out the crumpled wire transfer receipt from 10 years ago and pressed it against the window. "You didn't buy a legacy, Senator," Sera said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. "You bought a crime. My father didn't just take your money. He kept the logs of every shell company you used to funnel it. It's not just a bribe. It's federal racketeering, and the original copies aren't in a box in Grayhill. They're in a digital vault that pings a legal firm in Chicago every 24 hours unless I check in. The senator's eyes narrowed, the thin line of his mouth twitching. The power in the loading dock shifted so fast the air seemed to crack. Declan stepped forward, his hand finding the small of Sera's back. It wasn't a protective gesture, it was an alignment. He looked at the man he had feared for a decade and saw nothing but an old man in a cold car. "The merger is dead," Declan said. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his executive headset, snapping it in half. "Call the board. Tell them I'm liquidating my personal shares to buy the Gray Hill facility outright. If you touch her or her mother, the Chicago firm gets the signal. I've spent 10 years building a cage, Senator. I think it's time you saw the inside of one." Vane stared at them, his face pale and sharp, before the window rolled up with a mechanical hiss. The sedan roared to life, tires screeching against the concrete as it fled the dock. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't pressurized, it was hollow. Declan turned to Sera, his breathing ragged. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the hair back from her face. "I should have told you. I should have fought him then." "You were a boy," Sera whispered, the iron resolve in her voice finally fraying at the edges. "But I'm not the girl you left, and I'm not a liability you can manage." "I know," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "What happens now?" Sera looked at the black card Cormac had given her, still sitting on top of her suitcase, then back at the man who had traded everything to keep her mother alive in a world that wanted her forgotten. She took his hand and placed it firmly over her stomach. The shock that went through him was visible, a physical shudder that ended in a sharp, broken intake of breath. He looked down at her hand, then up at her eyes, the weight of the realization crashing over him. "Sera," he choked out. "The Gray Hill debt is paid, Declan," she said, stepping back into the shadow of the freight elevator. "But this is a debt you can't settle with a wire transfer." She didn't say she stayed. She didn't say she left. She simply watched the elevator doors begin to close, leaving Declan standing alone in the center of the loading dock, holding the brass key to a future he hadn't planned for. As the doors met, her phone buzzed one last time, an unknown number. "He thinks he's safe because he chose you. He doesn't know what my father does to things he can't own." Sera looked at the red light of the elevator as it ascended, the metal box rising toward a city that was about to burn. She closed her eyes, her hand resting on the life growing inside her, wondering if she had just traded one cage for a much more beautiful one.